Welcome. Tonight, we journey back through the passage of a century to a conflict that reshaped the world and redefined the very nature of warfare. You may wish to settle yourself comfortably now, to let the concerns of your day fade into the background, as we explore together the realities of the First World War, not through the lens of grand strategy or political maneuvering, but through the lived experience of those who endured it. The Great War, as it was known to those who fought it, transformed millions of young men into inhabitants of an underground world, a labyrinth of trenches that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. For 4 years, soldiers from nations across the globe lived, fought, and died in these muddy corridors carved into the earth of France and Belgium. As you listen tonight, you need not remain alert to every detail. Let the steady rhythm of this narrative wash over you. The story we explore is one of resilience and suffering, of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. It is a story that belongs to history now, separated from us by time and the comfort of distance. Imagine yourself stepping back through the years, through the decades, through a century of change, until you find yourself standing in the autumn of 1914, as Europe descends into a war that none truly understood would last 4 long years. The soldiers who marched to war that autumn believed they would be home by Christmas. They could not have imagined the world they were about to enter. Let us begin. You wake, if waking is the proper word for returning to consciousness from a state that was never quite sleep in the gray hour before dawn. This moment, repeated every morning without exception, is called Stand To, and it rules the beginning of each day in the trenches. Around you in the darkness, other men are stirring, rising from whatever rest they manage to claim during the night hours. The trench wall rises on either side of you, walls of sandbags stacked and restacked, held together with wooden frames and the eternal clinging mud that defines this place. Above, the sky is beginning to lighten, that dangerous transition from night to day when an attack might come. Every man must be at his post, rifle ready, bayonet fixed, eyes scanning the expanse of broken ground that separates your trench from the enemy's. Stand To lasts an hour, sometimes more. You stand on the fire step, the wooden platform built into the trench wall that raises you high enough to see over the parapet. Your hands grip your rifle. The cold has worked its way through your uniform during the night, the British khaki, or perhaps the French horizon blue, or the Feldgrau of the German forces, and your fingers are stiff on the weapon. The landscape before you, slowly revealed by the growing light, is unlike anything that existed in the world before this war. No man's land, they call it, and the name captures something essential about this space between the opposing lines. It belongs to no one. It is scarred by shell craters, some filled with water the color of rust, others gaping empty. Barbed wire stretches in great coils and tangles, glinting dully in the dawn. And scattered across this devastated ground, you can see the shapes that no one discusses openly, the bodies of men from previous attacks, unrecovered, slowly becoming part of the landscape itself. You scan for movement, for any sign that the enemy might be preparing an assault. Minutes pass. The light grows stronger. Birds, somehow still present despite everything, begin their morning songs, a sound so incongruous with your surroundings that it seems to come from another world entirely. And gradually, as the hour progresses and no attack materializes, the tension begins to ease slightly. Not to disappear, it never truly disappears, but to settle into the background state of alertness that becomes normal in this place. Finally, the order comes to stand down. You can step off the fire platform. The immediate danger of a dawn attack has passed. Another day in the trenches has begun. Breakfast arrives in containers, carried up the communication trenches from the rear. The food is never hot by the time it reaches you. Perhaps there is tea, weak and lukewarm, the color of dishwater, but containing enough warmth to be welcome. There are hard biscuits, nearly impossible to bite through unless you soak them first, and sometimes tinned beef or jam. The portions are measured carefully, distributed with an exactness that speaks to the logistical achievement of feeding millions of men in trenches, even as the quantity never quite feels adequate. You eat standing up or crouched against the trench wall. There are no tables here, no chairs, no amenities of normal life. You eat with your hands dirty from the mud that covers everything in air that carries the perpetual smell of this place. Combination of damp earth leachine, waste poison gas residue, and the sweet sickening odor of decomposition that drifts across from no man's land. After breakfast comes the work. The trenches are never finished, never complete. They require constant maintenance, constant attention. Overnight, shells have damaged sections of the parapet, collapsing sandbags that must be refilled and restacked. You and the other men in your section receive shovels, and you begin the work of repairs. The sandbags, when empty, are rough burlap. You hold one open while another man shovels mud into it. The mud is heavy, clinging, and the bags, when filled, weigh considerable amounts. You tie off the top and carry it to where it's needed, hefting it into place in the trench wall. The work is monotonous, repetitive, and endless. As soon as one section is repaired, another requires attention. The mud itself has a quality that those who never experience these trenches cannot quite understand. It is not the clean earth of a garden or field. It has been churned and rechurned by shells mixed with the detritus of war and transformed into a substance that seems almost alive in its capacity to cling, to resist, to work its way into every crevice of your uniform and equipment. In some sectors, particularly in Flanders, the mud becomes something close to liquid, a thick soup that can reach waist height in the bottom of poorly maintained trenches. As you work, you feel them. The lice. They inhabit every seam of your uniform, multiplying with impossible speed, despite every effort to control them. The itching is constant, maddening, a torment that never ceases. During rest periods, men sit and run the seams of their shirts and trousers through the flame of a candle, hearing the tiny pops as the parasites die, but it makes little difference. Within hours, the itching returns. The lice spread diseased trench fever, which brings weeks of recurring high temperatures and weakness. They are democracy in action, afflicting generals and privates alike, though the officers have better opportunities to bathe and change into clean uniforms. For the ordinary soldier, relief from the lice comes only when you are rotated out of the front-line trenches for rest periods behind the lines. And then there are the rats. You see them everywhere. These creatures grown large on the terrible abundance this war provides. They are the size of house cats, sleek and bold, and they scurry along the trench floors and walls with complete fearlessness. At night, you feel them running over you as you try to sleep. They eat the rations if given any opportunity, gnaw through packs and equipment, and most disturbing of all, they feed on the bodies that lie in no man's land, and sometimes in the trenches themselves when casualties cannot be immediately evacuated. Men develop a particular hatred for the rats that transcends the normal human aversion to vermin. They are killed when possible, shot or clubbed, but they continue to thrive. They are survivors, like the soldiers, adapting to this strange underground world and prospering in it after their fashion. When your shift of work is complete, when the immediate tasks have been finished, you may be able to retreat into a dugout to rest. These underground chambers, carved into the side of the trench walls, offer the closest thing to shelter available in this environment. The better dugouts, particularly those in sectors that have been occupied for longer periods, are elaborate affairs. They may have wooden floors, walls reinforced with timber, even crude furniture. Some dugouts go deep underground, connected by steps cut into the earth, offering real protection from all but a direct hit from heavy artillery. More commonly, however, the dugouts are shallow affairs, barely more than holes in the trench wall, covered with corrugated metal and sandbags. You crawl inside, and the space is barely large enough to lie down. The earth is damp around you, seeping moisture that keeps everything perpetually wet. The air is close. difficult to breathe if several men occupy the same dugout. Here, in this confined darkness, you try to rest. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by the sounds of the war continuing outside, the crack of sniper rifles, the occasional burst of machine gun fire, the whistle and crump of shells falling somewhere along the line. You sleep in your uniform, with your equipment nearby, ready to respond instantly if the alarm sounds. The danger of the dugouts is ever present. During bombardments, shells can collapse them, burying occupants alive beneath tons of earth and sandbags. Men have suffocated in collapsed dugouts, trapped beyond the reach of rescue. The deeper dugouts are safer from shells, but present their own risks if the entrance becomes blocked. There is no other way out. In the afternoon, the shelling often intensifies. Both sides engage in what is termed harassment fire, sending shells into the opposing trenches, not as preparation for an attack, but simply as a matter of routine. The sound of artillery becomes the constant background noise of trench life, so ever-present that its absence becomes noticeable and unsettling. You learn to identify shells by their sound. The high-pitched whistle of the smaller shells, the deeper roar of the heavy artillery. You learn to judge whether a shell is coming toward your section or will fall elsewhere. The men develop a dark humor about this, claiming they can hear the one with their name on it, though, of course, if you hear the shell, it has already passed over you. The impact of shells creates fountains of earth and debris. Shrapnel jagged metal fragments screams through the air, capable of severing limbs or killing instantly. The blast waves from near misses can rupture internal organs, even without visible wounds. And sometimes the shells simply fail to explode, burying themselves deep in the mud, where they become additional hazards that may detonate if disturbed. During a bombardment, all work stops. You take whatever cover is available, pressing yourself against the trench wall or taking shelter in the dugouts. The ground shakes with each impact. Dirt and debris rain down from above. The noise is beyond description, a physical force that seems to compress your chest and make thought impossible. Men emerge from heavy bombardments with blood running from their ears and noses, temporarily or permanently deafened by the concussive force. And yet, between bombardments, life continues. The routine reasserts itself. Orders are passed along the line. Rations arrive. Sentries maintain their watch. The trenches have their own rhythm, a pattern of activity that becomes almost normal through sheer repetition. Among all the dangers of trench warfare, poison gas holds a special place of terror. First deployed by the Germans in 1915 at Ypres, gas attacks transformed the very air into a weapon. You carry your gas mask with you always, a rubberized canvas hood with glass eyepieces and a respirator, stored in a bag that hangs around your neck. When gas is detected, the alarm, raised by sentries ringing bells, banging on metal, shouting warnings, you have seconds to respond. Your hands fumble with the bag, pulling out the mask, pulling it over your head, ensuring the seal is tight around your neck. Through the glass eyepieces, your vision is limited, distorted. Breathing through the respirator is laborious, each breath requiring effort. The gas itself comes in several varieties. Chlorine gas, appearing as a greenish-yellow cloud rolling along the ground, burns the lungs and throat. Phosgene, more deadly, is nearly colorless and has a smell compared to freshly cut hay, a deceptive quality that makes it particularly dangerous. Mustard gas, introduced later in the war, causes terrible blistering of the skin, blindness, and long-term injuries. You watch as the gas cloud approaches, moving slowly across no man's land, driven by the wind. It settles into shell holes and trenches, seeking the low ground. Men caught without their masks, or with faulty equipment, begin to cough and choke. Their faces turn blue. They gasp for air that sears their lungs. The lucky ones are evacuated quickly to medical stations. Others suffocate slowly, drowning in the fluid that fills their lungs. Even with your mask properly fitted, you remain in it for hours, until the all-clear is given and officers have tested the air and declared it safe. Your face under the mask becomes slick with sweat. The rubber pressed against your skin causes rashes and sores. But you keep it on, because removing it too early means injury or death. As darkness falls, the nature of trench life changes. The daylight hours, despite their dangers, have a certain structure, a rhythm of tasks and routines. Night brings different challenges and different work. Under cover of darkness, patrols venture out into no man's land. These are small groups of men, their faces blackened with burned cork or mud, carrying only essential equipment to minimize noise. Their missions vary: reconnaissance to observe enemy positions, listening posts established in shell holes to detect signs of enemy activity, and sometimes raids on enemy trenches. You might be selected for such a patrol. You crawl over the parapet, your rifle slung across your back or left behind in favor of a pistol and grenades. The ground of no man's land is treacherous in darkness shell holes that could break an ankle or swallow a man, tangles of wire that catch at equipment and clothing, and the ever-present possibility of encountering an enemy patrol engaged in similar activities. The tension of these patrols exceeds even the stress of bombardment. Every sound seems amplified in the darkness. The scrape of equipment, the squelch of mud, your own breathing, all seem impossibly loud. You freeze at the slightest noise, straining to identify its source. Is it one of your comrades? An enemy patrol? A rat disturbing the wire? Sometimes, patrols encounter each other in the darkness. Brief, vicious fights erupt, grenades thrown, pistol shots fired at point-blank range, men grappling hand-to-hand before breaking apart and fleeing back to their respective lines. Other times, patrols complete their missions without incident, gathering information about wire obstacles or enemy listening posts before creeping back to safety. For those remaining in the trenches, night brings its own duties. Working parties repair damage under cover of darkness, carrying supplies forward from the rear areas and improving defenses. The darkness provides concealment from enemy observation, but the work must be done in near silence to avoid drawing fire. Your feet, encased in boots that are perpetually wet, have become a source of constant concern. The condition called trench foot develops when feet remain cold and wet for extended periods. The flesh becomes pale and numb, then swollen and painful. In severe cases, the tissue dies, requiring amputation. You are ordered to change your socks regularly, to rub whale oil into your feet, but these preventative measures can only do so much when you are standing in water for hours or days at a time. Some sections of the trench system have better drainage than others. Wooden boards called duckboards, providing a surface above the worst of the mud and standing water. But many sections simply flood during rain, and the water has nowhere to go. The latrines, primitive wooden structures built at intervals along the trench system, add their own particular misery. They are breeding grounds for flies, sources of terrible smells, and during bombardments, they are frequently destroyed, spreading contamination through the trenches. Dysentery becomes endemic, weakening men through constant diarrhea and dehydration. The water supply, brought up in containers from the rear, is supposed to be purified with chloride of lime, but the treatment is not always effective. Men fall ill with stomach ailments, adding to the general misery of trench life. In winter, water freezes in canteens. In summer, it becomes warm and stale, but you drink it because dehydration is worse than any risk from contamination. Beyond the physical hardships, beyond the mud and lice and constant danger, there is the psychological weight of this existence. You are living underground in a landscape devoid of natural life except for rats and occasional birds. The trenches are a world unto themselves, disconnected from normal human experience. The boredom is, in its own way, as difficult as the danger. Hours pass in which nothing happens. You stand watch, or sit in a dugout, or perform monotonous tasks, and the time stretches endlessly. Men write letters home, trying to describe something of this experience to people who cannot possibly understand it. They'd play cards, gamble, share cigarettes, and talk about trivial things to maintain some sense of normalcy. And then, punctuating the boredom, come moments of absolute terror. A shell lands in your section, killing men you were speaking with moments before. A sniper's bullet finds its mark. You see a man beside you fall without warning, alive one instant and gone the next. A bombardment begins, and you huddle in your dugout, wondering if this will be the shell that collapses the earth above you. The randomness of death in the trenches is perhaps the hardest aspect to endure. There is no safety in courage, no protection in caution. A man may survive a dozen attacks only to be killed by a random shell during a quiet period. Another may be wounded on his first day in the front line. You cannot control your fate here. You can only endure and hope. Some men break under this pressure. They become unable to function, shaking uncontrollably, or staring blankly at nothing, or weeping without apparent cause. In the early years of the war, such men are often accused of cowardice. Later, there will be some recognition of psychological injury, but in the moment, there is little sympathy and no real treatment. Men who refuse orders or desert their posts may face court-martial and execution shot by their own side for failing to endure what has become unendurable. The only respite from the frontline trenches comes through rotation. Units are moved back after a period at the front, perhaps a week, perhaps longer depending on the sector and the military situation. You move back through the communication trenches, those zigzagging corridors that connect the front line to the support trenches and reserve positions behind. The support trenches, located a few hundred yards behind the front line, offer slightly better conditions, less intensive shelling, more developed dugouts, a slight reduction in immediate danger. Here, units rest and refit, though they remain close enough to move forward quickly if an attack requires reinforcement. Further back still are the reserve positions, and eventually the rest areas behind the lines. Here, men can bathe, change into clean uniforms, sleep in actual beds in barns or billets in villages that are damaged, but still partially standing. For a brief period, you are removed from the immediate presence of death, though the war is never truly distant. The sound of the guns continues always, a reminder that this respite is temporary. And then, inevitably, the orders come to move forward again. You gather your equipment, fall into formation, and march up the communication trenches toward the front line. The cycle repeats. Another tour in the trenches begins. The rhythm of this life continues, day after day, month after month, for some men across multiple years. Worst of all is the knowledge, carried always in the back of your mind, that eventually you will receive the order to attack. Going over the top is the phrase used, and it describes exactly what occurs, climbing out of the relative protection of the trench and advancing across no man's land toward the enemy lines. The attacks are planned by officers in headquarters behind the lines, marked out on maps with colored pins and careful calculations of distance and timing. But here, in the trench, preparing to go over the top, those plans reduce to something much simpler and more terrible. You will climb a ladder, step over the parapet, and walk into machine gun fire. The preparations begin hours before the attack. You clean your rifle, check your equipment, fix your bayonet. You are given extra ammunition, grenades, perhaps wire cutters, or other specialized tools. The officers distribute rum rations, small amounts of alcohol, meant to steady nerves. Some men welcome it. Others refuse it, wanting to face what comes next with clear heads. The artillery bombardment that precedes the attack is supposed to destroy the enemy's defenses, to cut the wire, collapse the trenches, eliminate the machine gun positions. You listen to your own artillery firing, the shells passing overhead with sounds like tearing cloth, and you try to believe that this bombardment will be sufficient, that when you advance, the enemy will be destroyed or too stunned to resist. But you have seen too many attacks, too many times when the artillery failed to do its job. You know about the deep German dugouts that can shelter their troops through the bombardment. You know that machine guns can be set up in minutes once the shelling stops. And so, as the hour of the attack approaches, the fear builds. The whistle blows. The moment arrives. You climb the ladder. You step over the parapet. And suddenly, you are exposed, standing upright in that terrible landscape of no man's land, and the machine guns open fire. Men fall around you. The sound of bullets is everywhere. The crack as they pass close, the thud as they strike bodies, the screams of the wounded. You walk forward because those are your orders, because stopping means death as surely as advancing, because the momentum of the attack and the men around you carry you along. The distance to the enemy trench might be 100 yards, or 200, or more, and it must be crossed at a walk because you carry too much equipment to run. Some men reach the enemy trenches. Fighting becomes close, and personal grenades thrown into dugouts, bayonets used, pistols fired at point-blank range. Other men never get close to their objective, cut down in the first minutes of the advance. The attack may succeed in capturing a section of trench. It may fail entirely, forcing survivors to retreat back to their starting positions. Either way, the casualties are staggering. And after the attack, whether successful or not, life in the trenches continues. The wounded are evacuated. The dead are buried if possible, or left where they fell. The routine reasserts itself. Stand to at dawn, breakfast, maintenance and repair. The endless rhythm of this subterranean existence. This is life in the trenches of the First World War. It is monotony and terror, boredom and sudden violence, cold and wet and lice and mud, and the constant presence of death. It is unlike any human experience before it, and it will shape those who survive it for the remainder of their lives. You endure because you must, because there is no alternative, because the men beside you endure, and you cannot let them down. You endure because behind you stands the military justice system, ready to execute deserters. You endure because somewhere inside you remains the hope that you might survive, that this war will eventually end, that you might return to the world you left behind. But that world seems increasingly distant, increasingly unreal. The trenches become your reality, and everything else the homes and families. The peacetime concerns, the world of civilian life, becomes a dream, something remembered hazily from another existence. The rhythm of trench life continues. Stand to at dawn, breakfast, work, the evening stand to, the night duties. And always, always, the awareness that this day might be your last, that the next shell or bullet or attack might carry your name. This was the reality for millions of men from 1914 to 1918, a reality that stretched across the Western Front from the Channel to the Alps, and repeated itself on other fronts across Europe and beyond. The Great War transformed warfare into an industrial process, and the trenches were the visible manifestation of that transformation along scars in the earth, where men lived and died in conditions that would have been unimaginable just a few years before. As we move forward in our exploration tonight, we will examine specific moments and aspects of this war, but let this foundation remain the daily reality of trench warfare, the texture of life underground, the slow grinding endurance required simply to survive from one day to the next in this strange and terrible world. The daily rhythms of trench life, with all their hardships and monotony, formed the background against which the larger movements of the war played out. Individual soldiers, living their underground existence, were often unaware of the grand strategies being planned in headquarters far behind the lines. But in the early summer of 1916, something different was being prepared, an offensive of unprecedented scale, designed to break through the German lines and restore movement to a war that had become frozen in stalemate. The Somme, the name refers to a river in northern France, a quiet waterway that wound through countryside of gentle hills and agricultural villages. Before the war, this had been peaceful farmland. By 1916, It had become a sector of the Western Front, and it was here that British and French commanders decided to launch their great offensive. The goal was ambitious: to break the German defensive system, to relieve pressure on the French armies fighting desperately at Verdun to the south, and perhaps, if things went extraordinarily well, to win the war. For the soldiers who would carry out this offensive, the preparations were visible for weeks beforehand. Troops concentrated in the area. Supplies accumulated in vast dumps behind the lines. Artillery pieces arrived in numbers never before assembled over. 1,500 guns positioned along a front of roughly 15 miles. The bombardment these guns would deliver was intended to be so devastating, so overwhelming, that the German defenses would simply cease to exist. Let us move forward now, through the spring of 1916 to late June, as the final preparations for the Battle of the Somme reached their conclusion. On June 24, 1916, the artillery opens fire. The sound is unlike anything heard before in human history, a continuous roar that can be heard in England, across the Channel, over 100 miles distant. For 7 days, with only brief pauses, the British guns pour shells onto the German positions. You might be among the infantry units waiting behind the lines, and this bombardment shapes your expectations. Surely you think nothing could survive such fury. The officers assure you that the wire will be cut, the trenches collapsed, the German defenders killed or so stunned that they will offer no resistance. You are told that the advance will be little more than a march across no man's land to occupy positions that have been rendered defenseless. The shells fall in their thousands, their millions. High explosive rounds intended to destroy trenches and dugouts. Shrapnel shells meant to cut the wire obstacles. The German positions disappear behind fountains of earth and smoke. The landscape itself is being rearranged by the weight of metal falling upon it. Entire woods are shattered into matchsticks. Villages that stood in the path of the bombardment simply cease to exist as recognizable structures. At night, the gun flashes light the horizon in a continuous flickering that makes the darkness seem to pulse. The ground trembles steadily from the impacts. And still the bombardment continues, hour after hour, day after day. 7 days of this, an expenditure of ammunition on a scale never before attempted. But beneath this storm of steel, in dugouts dug deep into the chalk beneath the Somme countryside, German troops are sheltering. Their defenses in this sector have been prepared over nearly 2 years. The dugouts go down 30 feet or more, reinforced with heavy timbers and concrete. The men inside endure the bombardment in darkness, surrounded by the sound of shells impacting above them, never quite certain that the next explosion won't be the one that collapses their shelter. It is its own form of hell, this waiting underground while the earth shakes, but it is survivable. And the British shells, for all their number, are not accomplishing what was intended. Many are defective, failing to explode. Others simply lack the power to destroy deep fortifications. Most critically, the shrapnel shells meant to cut the barbed wire are largely ineffective. Wire requires direct hits to be cut, and the shrapnel shells burst above ground, spraying fragments that may catch on the wire, but rarely cut it. The British command, observing from miles behind the lines, sees the explosions and assumes success. How could anything survive such bombardment? But they are wrong, and this error will have consequences measured in tens of thousands of lives. The bombardment ends, finally, on the evening of June 30th. After 7 days of continuous thunder, a strange quiet descends. In the British trenches, units are moved forward to their jumping-off positions. You would be among them, moving up through the communication trenches in the darkness, loaded with equipment for the advance. The equipment is considerable. You carry your rifle and bayonet, naturally, but also 200 rounds of ammunition, extra rations for several days, 2 gas masks, a steel helmet, a shovel, grenades, wire cutters, flares, and various other items deemed necessary. The total weight approaches 70 pounds. Distributed across your body, in ways that make movement difficult and running nearly impossible. The rationale for this heavy load is that you will need to hold the German trenches once captured to consolidate the position against counterattack. But the practical effect is that you are transformed to something like a pack animal, burdened and slow, capable only of walking at a deliberate pace. You reach your position in the frontline trench. It is crowded with men, units packed together, waiting for dawn. Some men try to sleep, though sleep is nearly impossible with the anticipation of what tomorrow will bring. Others write letters, perhaps final letters, though the optimistic briefings suggest this will be an easy advance. Officers move along the trench, checking equipment, offering encouragement, consulting watches and naps. The night is quiet, eerily so after the week of bombardment. You can hear German voices across no man's land, carried on the night air. Their trenches are not destroyed. You can see movement there, shadows in the darkness. This should perhaps concern the planners, this evidence that the enemy survives, but the plan is set and will proceed regardless. As midnight passes and July 1st begins, the last hours before the attack tick away. The sky begins to lighten in the east. Stand to is called, though no one has truly been at rest. You check your rifle once more. You adjust the equipment straps that dig into your shoulders, and you wait for the whistle that will send you forward. The bombardment resumes at first light, a final intense pounding of the German lines. Mines that have been tunneled beneath German positions explode with tremendous force, creating vast craters and hopefully destroying sections of their defenses. The thunder of the guns continues until 7:28 a.m. And then, with a precision that speaks to careful planning, the barrage lifts, shifting to targets further behind the German front line. At 7:30 a.m., officers along the entire assault front blow their whistles. The sound is thin and almost fragile compared to the artillery, but it is the signal everyone has been waiting for. You climb the ladder, you step over the parapet, and you begin walking toward the German trenches, roughly 300 yards distant across no man's land. The first waves go forward in lines, maintaining formation as they have been drilled to do. The sun is climbing into a sky that will become cloudless and hot. It is going to be a beautiful summer day. And in the German trenches, men are emerging from their dugouts, shaken and deafened by the bombardment, but very much alive. And they are setting up their machine guns. The German machine gunners reach their positions and see something that seems almost impossible: lines of British soldiers, advancing toward them in the open, walking slowly, not taking cover, presenting perfect targets. The MGO-8 machine guns, heavy water-cooled weapons, capable of firing 450 rounds per minute, open fire. The effect is immediate and catastrophic. Men fall in groups, entire sections cut down in moments. The survivors continue forward because those are their orders, stepping over bodies, maintaining formation. More machine guns open fire along the German line. The fields of the Somme become a killing ground unlike anything seen before in warfare. In some sectors, soldiers reach the German wire and discover it has not been cut. They bunch up at the wire obstacles, trying to find gaps, trying to cut through with their wire cutters. And the machine guns concentrate fire on these helpless clusters of men. The wire becomes draped with bodies, British soldiers who died within sight of their objective, but unable to reach it. Other sectors see some initial success, where the German defenses were genuinely damaged by the bombardment, or where the assault troops moved quickly enough to reach the trenches before the machine guns were fully deployed. Small groups of British soldiers fight their way into the German positions. But these gains are localized and cannot be exploited. The follow-up waves suffer the same casualties as the first, and reinforcement becomes impossible. The advance continues in some areas until mid-morning, waves of soldiers still being sent forward long after it has become clear that the attack is failing. The generals, far from the front, receive conflicting reports and are slow to understand the scale of the disaster unfolding. Units that have been destroyed still appear on their maps as functional formations. Orders continue to arrive, calling for renewed efforts, for one more push that will surely break through. By noon, the attack has effectively ended along most of the front. The British trenches are filled with wounded men who have managed to crawl back across no man's land. The open ground between the lines is scattered with bodies, some still, others moving feebly, crying out for help that will not come during daylight hours. The German machine guns still command the ground, and any attempt at rescue draws immediate fire. As the day progresses and reports gradually filter back to headquarters, the scale of the casualties begins to become clear, though the full accounting will take days to complete. On this single day, July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffers approximately 57,000 casualties. Of these, 19,240 men are killed or die of their wounds. Another 38,000 are wounded, many grievously. Roughly 2,000 are missing, a category that often means bodies lost in no man's land or obliterated by shells. These numbers are difficult to grasp. They represent more casualties in one day than the British Army suffered in the entire Crimean War, in the Boer War, in most previous British conflicts combined. It is the bloodiest day in the history of the British military, a record that stands still over a century later. Behind the statistics are individual stories, repeated thousands of times across the battlefield. A young man from Leeds, perhaps, who climbed over the parapet at 7:30 a.m. and was struck by machine gun fire before he had walked 20 paces. A sergeant from Manchester, who led his men across no man's land, reached the German wire and died trying to cut through it. An officer from London who made it into the German trench fought with his revolver until the ammunition was exhausted and was killed in the close-quarter struggle. The medical services behind the British lines are overwhelmed. Casualty clearing stations designed to handle perhaps a few hundred wounded in a day receive thousands. Doctors and nurses work without rest, triaging the wounded, separating those who might be saved from those too badly injured to survive. The lightly wounded wait hours for treatment. The seriously wounded are operated on in crude conditions, their chances of survival poor at best. And in the British trenches, the survivors of the attack huddle in shock. Units that went forward at full strength return as fragments. A platoon of 40 men reduced to 8, a company of 250 reduced to 30. The officers who planned the attack consult their maps and begin planning the next phase of the offensive. The Battle of the Somme has only just begun. Among the casualties of that first day is a particular tragedy that strikes deep at communities across Britain. The PALS battalions, a recruiting innovation from 1914, have suffered devastating losses. These units were formed with the promise that men who enlisted together would serve together. Friends from the same town, workers from the same factory, members of the same sports club, they joined up as groups, were trained together, and sent to the front as cohesive units. The idea was meant to encourage recruitment, to offer the comfort of serving alongside familiar faces rather than among strangers. In some ways, the PALS battalions were effective military units. The bonds between men who knew each other before the war were strong. But on July 1st, 1916, a flaw in this system becomes apparent. When a PALS battalion goes over the top and is destroyed by machine gun fire, entire communities lose their young men in a single morning. The Accrington PALS, recruited from a small Lancashire town, attacked toward the village of Serre. Of the 720 men who advance, 584 become casualties within the first hour. Accrington, with a total population of about 45,000, loses a substantial portion of its young male population before breakfast time. The Sheffield City Battalion attacks at Serre as well. Of 900 men, over 500 are killed or wounded in the first minutes. Sheffield must absorb this loss, must somehow continue as a community with this wound at its heart. The Tyneside Irish Brigade, units recruited from Newcastle and the surrounding area, advances at La Boisselle. They are cut down in the open, wave after wave walking into machine gun fire. The casualties number in the thousands. Neighborhoods in Newcastle will never fully recover. These examples repeat themselves across the battlefield. The Grimsby Chums, the Leeds Pals, the Bradford Pals, the Liverpool Pals. Each community has sent its young men to war together, and each community will receive the casualty list together. The telegrams arrive in clusters, street after street receiving news of deaths or injuries. The shared mourning is intense, the loss concentrated rather than diffused. In the years after the war, when memorials are erected in towns across Britain, the lists of names from single days, particularly July 1st, 1916, dominate the inscriptions. Entire football teams gone, school classes disappeared, workplaces emptied of young men. The PALS battalions, created to harness community bonds for military purposes, instead deliver community-wide tragedy. Across no man's land, the German defenders have their own experience of this day. They have endured the week-long bombardment, trapped in their dugouts, uncertain of survival. The noise and the darkness, and the endless shaking of the earth have taxed their endurance. Some men have broken under the strain, are found after the bombardment unable to function, staring blankly or trembling uncontrollably. But when the bombardment lifts, discipline and training reassert themselves. The defenders scramble up from the dugouts, dragging their machine guns, reaching their firing positions, just as the British soldiers appear on the opposite parapet. What they see seems incomprehensible lines of soldiers advancing slowly, upright, making no attempt at concealment. The German soldiers set up their weapons and open fire. It is not glorious. It is mechanical, methodical, the machine guns traversing back and forth, cutting down the advancing lines. Many German accounts from this day express a kind of horror at what they are doing, at the mechanical slaughter of brave men who continue advancing into certain death. In sectors where British soldiers reach the German trenches, fierce fighting ensues. The Germans fight to hold their positions, throwing grenades into groups of attackers, engaging in hand-to-hand combat in the narrow confines of the trenches. But the overall German casualties for the day are relatively light, perhaps 8,000 compared to the 57,000 suffered by the British. The defensive position, the fortifications, and the machine guns have provided overwhelming advantage. As evening approaches and the British attacks cease, the German defenders remain in their trenches, looking out over no man's land scattered with bodies. Some British wounded are still alive out there, crying for help, calling for water or medics, or simply crying. The sounds continue through the night, gradually diminishing as men succumb to their wounds or exposure. The catastrophe of July 1st might have been expected to cause a halt to the offensive, a reconsideration of tactics and strategy. Instead, the Battle of the Somme continues. General Haig and his staff, having committed to this offensive, decide to persist. The objectives have not been achieved, but surely with modification and adjustment, breakthrough can still be accomplished. The battle continues through July, through August, through September and October, into November, when winter weather finally forces a halt. It becomes a grinding attrition, a slow advance measured in yards rather than miles, each small gain purchased with thousands of casualties. Tanks are introduced in September, used in combat for the first time in warfare history, but they are too few and too unreliable to make a decisive difference. Tactics evolve slowly, painfully, through trial and error that costs lives with each iteration. The British Army learns how to fight this new kind of industrial warfare, but the learning comes at a terrible price. By the time the Battle of the Somme officially ends in November 1916, the British and French have advanced approximately 7 miles at the deepest point of their penetration. The German lines have been pushed back, but not broken. The strategic objectives have not been achieved, and the cost has been staggering: over 600,000 Allied casualties and approximately 500,000 German casualties. More than 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing to gain a few miles of devastated landscape. The landscape over which this battle was fought had been peaceful farmland. Villages with centuries of history, Paziers, Thiepval, Beaumont-Hamel, Flers, Longwevel, are destroyed utterly. After the battle, some of these villages will be rebuilt. Others remain as memorials, too damaged to reconstruct, left as ruins to mark what occurred there. Thiepval, a village on high ground, becomes the site of the largest British war memorial. The Thiepval Memorial bears the names of over 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died on the Somme and have no known grave. Their bodies were never recovered or never identified, lost in the churned mud of the battlefield. Walking this landscape today, over a century later, the scars remain visible. The shell craters, though softened by time and grass, still dimple the fields. The trenches can still be traced in places. And the cemeteries, so many cemeteries, with their rows of white headstones, each representing a life cut short in this battle. The Lochnagar crater, created by a massive mine explosion at 7:28 a.m. on July 1st, remains as a vast depression in the earth, 300 feet across and 90 feet deep. It has become a place of pilgrimage, a tangible reminder of the forces unleashed here. Visitors stand at its rim and try to imagine the sound of that explosion, the scale of the violence, and find themselves unable to truly comprehend it. In the days and weeks following July 1st, letters arrive in homes across Britain. The official telegrams come first. The War Office regrets to inform you. But later come letters from comrades, from officers, trying to explain what happened, trying to offer some comfort to families who have lost sons, fathers, brothers. These letters follow patterns, using similar language, because what can truly be said? He died bravely. He did not suffer. He was a good soldier, well liked by his comrades. The families receive these letters and must reconcile them with the absence, with the empty chair at the table, with the silence where a voice should be. Some families never receive certainty. The missing are the hardest category men who disappeared in the battle, whose bodies were never found, who might theoretically be prisoners, though German casualty reports make clear they are not. Hope and grief become mingled in ways that prevent closure. Years later, some families are still hoping for news, still unable to fully accept the loss. The mothers and wives and sisters become the Gold Star families, wearing their grief as a badge of sacrifice. They join organizations of the bereaved, finding community with others who understand their loss. But the absence remains, a permanent shadow over the remainder of their lives. The Battle of the Somme, and particularly its first day, becomes a defining moment in British consciousness. It represents something about the experience of the First World War that other battles, though equally bloody, somehow do not capture as completely. Perhaps it is the scale of the casualties in a single day. Perhaps it is the contrast between the optimistic planning and the terrible reality. Perhaps it is the tragedy of the PALS battalions, the way entire communities were wounded simultaneously. In the decades after the war, survivors struggled to explain what happened on the Somme. How does one convey the experience to people who were not there? The mud, the noise, the fear, the deaths of friends, these resist translation into words that civilians can understand. Many veterans choose silence, finding it easier to say nothing than to attempt inadequate explanation. The literature and poetry that emerged from the war often returned to the Somme. Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Edmund Blunden, these writers who served on the Western Front processed their experiences through their work, and the Somme appears repeatedly as a central trauma, an event that shapes everything that follows. For historians, the Battle of the Somme becomes a subject of endless analysis and debate. Was it necessary? Could it have been conducted differently? Were the casualties justified by the strategic results? These questions have no settled answers, though many opinions are offered. What remains clear is that the Somme represents a particular kind of military disaster, brave men sent to die by the thousands in attacks that had little chance of success. Their sacrifice demanded by a strategic situation that offered few good alternatives. As darkness falls on July 1st, 1916, the battlefield takes on a different character. The machine guns fall silent. The artillery fire diminishes. And in no man's land, in the shell holes entangled in the wire, thousands of wounded men remain, unable to return to British lines, beyond the reach of medical help. Some cry out. Others lie in silence, conserving strength, hoping to survive until darkness might allow rescue. The Germans, in some sectors, permit stretcher bearers to recover wounded, holding their fire during these mercy missions. In other sectors, any movement draws fire, and the wounded must simply wait and hope. The night is long for those lying wounded between the lines. The summer darkness brings cooler temperatures, and men who have lost blood become cold, shivering despite the season. Thirst becomes overwhelming. Some wounded men have water bottles, though many lost their equipment when hit. They drink their water slowly, rationing it, uncertain how long they will be in this situation. As the night deepens, more stretcher-bearer parties venture out from the British trenches. They move carefully, listening for calls for help, finding wounded men and carrying them back. It is dangerous work. The darkness is not absolute. Flares are fired periodically, and any exposure risks drawing fire. But the stretcher-bearers continue their work, driven by compassion and duty, saving who they can. By dawn on July 2nd, many wounded have been recovered. But many remain, and when daylight returns, the machine guns command the ground once more. Those still alive in no man's land face another day of exposure. Without water, without medical care, their chances of survival diminishing with each hour. Some men, gravely wounded on July 1st, survive for days in no man's land before finally being reached. Their accounts describe hallucinations brought on by thirst and pain, memories of home becoming confused with present reality, time losing meaning. For those who survive, the experience leaves permanent marks, nightmares, an inability to tolerate confinement, a deep gratitude mixed with survivor's guilt. The Battle of the Somme, though it continues for months after July 1st, never quite escapes the shadow of that first day. The soldiers who fight through the remainder of the battle do so knowing what has already been sacrificed, what the cost has been for minimal gain. The optimism of late June is gone, replaced by a grim determination to see the offensive through, to make the deaths mean something through eventual victory. But as we move forward now, away from the Somme, we carry with us the understanding of what industrial warfare means. What happens when millions of men and thousands of guns are concentrated in a small area? When attack and defense have become so evenly matched that victory requires casualties on an almost incomprehensible scale. The experience of the Somme, for those who survived it, became a reference point, a measure against which all other hardships were judged. It was bad, a veteran might say of a later battle, but it wasn't the Somme. The battle entered language as a byword for futility, for sacrifice, for the particular tragedy of the First World War. We will return, as our night continues, to other aspects of this war, to mysteries and questions that persist even now, to the different realities experienced by those at various levels of the military hierarchy. But let the Somme stand as a marker, a single day that somehow encapsulates larger truths about this conflict, about what was asked of ordinary men, about what they endured and what they lost. The summer sun set on July 1st, 1916, over fields that had become graveyards. The rivers ran red, metaphorically, if not literally. And the war continued, because it had to continue, because too much had already been invested to stop, because the political and military leaders who directed these events saw no alternative path forward. Rest now in the knowledge that you are removed by time and distance from these events, that you live in a world shaped by but distinct from this terrible past. We have explored, in these quiet hours together, the physical realities of the First World War, the mud and wire of the trenches, the catastrophic violence of battles like the Somme. These are wounds that can be seen, counted, recorded in medical logs and casualty statistics. A bullet leaves an entry wound. A shell fragment severs or penetrates. These injuries, however terrible, conform to an understanding of warfare that extends back through centuries of human conflict. But the Great War produced another category of casualty, one that proved far more difficult to understand, to classify, to treat. These were the men who returned from the front with no visible injuries, yet who were profoundly damaged. They shook uncontrollably. They could not speak. They woke screaming from nightmares. They flinched at sudden sounds. They stared into nothing, unreachable, trapped somewhere between the front lines and safety. The condition came to be called shell shock, a term that captured the initial belief that these symptoms resulted from physical damage caused by artillery explosions. But shell shock, as it came to be understood, was something more complex and more troubling, a window into the limits of human endurance, a challenge to assumptions about courage and breakdown, and ultimately, a catalyst for fundamental changes in how medicine and society understand psychological trauma. Let us turn now, as the night deepens around you, to this invisible wound of the Great War, to the men who bore it and the physicians who struggled to understand and treat it. The symptoms appeared early in the war, almost as soon as troops entered sustained combat. Men would arrive at field hospitals with no apparent physical injuries, yet clearly unable to function. They trembled violently, their hands shaking so severely they could not hold a cup or light a cigarette. Some had lost the ability to walk, despite having legs that were anatomically intact. Others could not speak, their voices simply gone, though their throats showed no damage. The medical officers who first encountered these cases were uncertain how to classify them. In previous wars, there had been isolated instances of psychological breakdown. Soldier's heart in the American Civil War, nostalgia in earlier conflicts, but nothing on this scale, nothing with this variety of symptoms. And in the opening months of the war, when fighting was mobile and casualties were primarily physical, these psychological cases were rare enough to be treated as anomalies, individual failures, rather than symptoms of something larger. But as the war settled into trench warfare, as the bombardments intensified and continued day after day, week after week, the numbers grew. By 1915, psychological casualties were arriving at hospitals in significant numbers, not dozens, but hundreds, then thousands. Men who had been effective soldiers, who had shown no previous signs of weakness, who had survived months in the trenches, would suddenly collapse. Some broke during bombardments. Others broke after battles. Still others seemed to break during quiet periods, as if the accumulated stress had finally exceeded some internal threshold. The symptoms varied in their specific manifestations, but shared common patterns. Uncontrollable shaking, known as tremor, affected many patients. The shaking might be localized to the hands, or might affect the entire body. Violent convulsions that made any purposeful movement impossible. Some men developed paralysis, unable to move arms or legs, despite the absence of physical injury. Mutism was common. Men who could not speak or whose speech was reduced to stuttering and repetition. The nightmares were perhaps the most consistent symptom. Men would sleep briefly, then wake screaming, reliving attacks or bombardments. Some became afraid to sleep, fighting exhaustion for days, because closing their eyes meant returning to the trenches in their dreams. Others developed an exaggerated startle response, jumping violently at any loud noise, dropping to the ground at the sound of a door slamming or a car backfiring. In the military culture of 1914 to 1918, these symptoms created a profound dilemma. The armies of the Great War operated on principles of discipline and courage. Soldiers were expected to obey orders, to advance under fire, to endure hardship without complaint. The military justice system dealt harshly with failures of discipline desertion. Cowardice, refusing orders could all result in execution by firing squad. So when men arrived exhibiting symptoms of shell shock, a question immediately arose. Were these men genuinely ill, or were they malingering, seeking to escape the front through deception? Were they victims of forces beyond their control, or were they simply cowards? The military establishment, particularly in the early years of the war, leaned heavily toward the latter interpretation. Men who shook or could not speak were viewed with suspicion. Officers questioned whether the symptoms might be voluntary, whether a man might choose to shake his hands, might decide not to speak in order to be evacuated from the front. The fact that many shell shock cases had no visible wounds made them suspect in a way that soldiers missing limbs or bearing obvious scars were not. This suspicion had terrible consequences. Some men suffering from psychological breakdown were accused of cowardice and brought before court-martial. The British Army executed 306 soldiers during the First World War for military offenses including desertion, cowardice, and disobedience. Many of these men, research has subsequently shown, were almost certainly suffering from what we would now recognize as severe combat trauma. They were not cowards choosing to flee. They were psychologically shattered men who could no longer function in the environment that had broken them. The case files, examined decades later, reveal tragic patterns. A soldier with an exemplary record, months or years of service, suddenly unable to continue, running from a bombardment, or refusing to go over the top. A court-martial convened quickly. Character witnesses often spoke of previous good service, but the immediate needs of military discipline overrode considerations of past performance. Guilty verdicts. Sentences of death. Executions carried out at dawn. The condemned man tied to a post. A firing squad of his own comrades assembled to kill him. These executed soldiers were not cowards in any meaningful sense of the word. They were casualties of the war as surely as those killed by German bullets. But their injuries were not visible, not understood, and therefore not recognized as legitimate. Their families bore an additional burden, not just grief, but shame, the stigma of having a relative executed for cowardice. It would take decades, until 2006, for the British government to issue posthumous pardons to these executed soldiers, a recognition that they had been victims rather than criminals. Among the medical officers encountering these psychological casualties was Captain Charles Samuel Myers, a physician and psychologist serving with the Royal Army Medical Corps. Myers had been educated at Cambridge, had studied psychology at a time when it was still a relatively new scientific discipline, and brought to his military service a curiosity about the workings of the human mind. In early 1915, Myers published a paper in the medical journal The Lancet describing 3 cases of soldiers exhibiting psychological symptoms following exposure to shell fire. He proposed the term shell shock to describe their condition, suggesting that the concussive effects of nearby shell explosions might be producing physical damage to the nervous system, even in the absence of visible wounds. The term caught on immediately, spreading through medical and military circles with remarkable speed. It offered an explanation that preserved the soldier's honor shell shock, suggested injury rather than weakness, something done to the soldier rather than something the soldier chose. If a man had been shell-shocked, he was a victim of enemy action, not a failure of character. But even as Myers introduced the term, he harbored doubts about its accuracy. The concussive theory, the idea that shock waves from explosions were physically damaging the brain or nervous system, could not explain all the cases he was seeing. Some shell-shock victims had never been close to an explosion. Others had been exposed to bombardments that left comrades physically unscathed while they broke down psychologically. The symptoms appeared too variable, too dependent on individual factors, to be purely physical in origin. Myers began to suspect that shell shock was primarily psychological, that it resulted not from physical brain damage, but from the overwhelming stress of combat, the accumulated effect of fear and horror endured over extended periods. This was a more troubling explanation in some ways, because it suggested that every soldier had a breaking point, that given sufficient stress, any man might develop these symptoms. It democratized psychological breakdown, removing the stigma of individual weakness but raising uncomfortable questions about how long anyone could be expected to endure the conditions of industrial warfare. The question of what caused shell shock became the subject of intense medical debate. On one side were those who maintained that the condition was primarily physical, that repeated exposure to concussive blasts from shells produced cumulative brain damage, microscopic injuries that eventually manifested as tremor, paralysis, or other symptoms. This theory had the advantage of conforming to traditional medical models that emphasized physical causes for observable symptoms. Supporting the physical theory were cases where soldiers developed shell shock symptoms immediately after being blown up by nearby explosions, even when they suffered no penetrating wounds. Surely, advocates argued, the blast itself must be producing damage. Additionally, some autopsies of soldiers who died after suffering shell shock showed minor hemorrhages in the brain, though these findings were inconsistent and could not explain the full range of symptoms. On the other side were physicians like Myers, who increasingly believed shell shock was fundamentally psychological. They pointed to cases where soldiers broke down far from any explosions, where the trigger seemed to be cumulative stress rather than any single physical event. They noted that symptoms often correlated with particularly horrific experiences: seeing close friends killed, being trapped in collapsed dugouts, surviving repeated attacks. The psychological explanation accounted for the variability in symptoms and in who was affected. The psychological theory also drew on emerging understanding from the relatively new field of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud and his colleagues were developing theories about how traumatic experiences could affect the unconscious mind, producing symptoms that manifested physically despite having psychological origins. Some physicians treating shell shock began applying these ideas, interpreting symptoms as expressions of repressed trauma or internal conflicts. The debate was never fully resolved during the war itself. Different hospitals and different physicians adopted different theoretical frameworks and different treatments. Some institutions continued to treat shell shock as primarily physical, focusing on rest and physical therapies. Others embraced psychological interpretations and therapies. The lack of consensus reflected genuine uncertainty. Shell shock clearly existed, but its fundamental nature remained elusive. What gradually became clear, however, was that regardless of the underlying cause, shell shock represented a legitimate medical condition. By 1916 to 1917, the sheer numbers of cases had forced even skeptical military authorities to accept that these men were not simply malingering. Specialized hospitals were established to treat shell shock patients. Medical officers were trained in recognition and initial management of psychological casualties. The condition entered official military nomenclature, appearing in casualty reports and medical statistics. The hospitals established to treat shell shock patients experimented with various approaches, some helpful, others misguided or actively harmful. With no established protocols and limited understanding of the condition, physicians improvised treatments based on their theoretical understanding and their observations of what seemed to work. Rest and isolation formed the foundation of many treatment programs. Patients were removed from the front, evacuated to hospitals in quiet locations away from the sounds of battle. They were given adequate food, allowed to sleep, removed from the immediate stresses that had produced the breakdown. For some patients, particularly those whose symptoms were relatively mild, this alone proved sufficient. After weeks or months of rest, they recovered enough to return to duty, though often to rear area positions rather than frontline service. Talk therapy, rudimentary by modern standards, but progressive for its time, was employed by some physicians. Patients were encouraged to describe their experiences, to narrate the events that had led to their breakdown. The theory was that bringing traumatic memories into consciousness, examining them in the safety of the hospital, might rob them of their power to produce symptoms. Some patients found this helpful, though others found it re-traumatizing, unable to discuss what they had experienced without severe distress. Hypnosis was used by physicians influenced by psychoanalytic theory. Under hypnosis, patients might be able to access memories or emotions that were blocked during normal consciousness. Some dramatic recoveries were reported using this technique. Patients who regained speech under hypnosis, or whose tremors ceased. But hypnosis proved unreliable, working well with some patients, and not at all with others. And there were concerns about suggestion, about whether hypnosis was genuinely curing the condition, or merely suppressing symptoms temporarily. More controversial were the physical treatments applied to shell shock patients, particularly electrical therapy. This treatment involved applying electrical current to affected body parts, to the throat of a mute patient, to the legs of a paralyzed patient, to the hands of someone with tremor. The electrical stimulation was painful, deliberately so in some protocols, based on the theory that providing a physical stimulus might shock the nervous system back into normal function. The most notorious practitioner of electrical therapy was Dr. Louis Yealand at the National Hospital in London. His methods, described in his own publications and later examined critically by historians, involved applying strong electrical currents to patients while commanding them to overcome their symptoms. A mute patient might have electrodes applied to his throat while being ordered repeatedly to speak. The treatment continued until the patient complied or the physician judged it ineffective. Some patients did recover speech or movement during or after these electrical treatments. Yealand published cases he considered successes. Men who entered his treatment room mute or paralyzed and left hours later apparently cured. But at what cost? The treatments were described by patients as agonizing, and the cures may have been more about desperate compliance men forcing themselves to speak or walk to escape further torture than genuine therapeutic benefit. And many patients who recovered under such treatment relapsed later, their symptoms returning once they were removed from the hospital environment. The use of painful electrical therapy reveals something troubling about attitudes toward shell shock, even among medical professionals theoretically committed to treating it. There remained an undercurrent of suspicion, a belief that symptoms might be voluntary and could be reversed through sufficient motivation. The electrical treatments were, in effect, punishment disguised as therapy, based on the assumption that the pain of treatment would outweigh the benefits of maintaining symptoms. The specialized hospitals established to treat shell shock became strange. Liminal spaces, neither quite medical institutions in the traditional sense, nor military installations, occupied by men who were neither healthy nor physically wounded in conventional ways. Craig Lockhart War Hospital near Edinburgh became particularly well known, partly because it treated several officers who would later become famous writers: Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and others whose poetry would shape how the war was remembered. Craig Lockhart and similar institutions housed dozens or hundreds of patients, men at various stages of recovery or decline, creating communities of the psychologically wounded. The hospitals maintained routines meant to provide structure and normalcy. Patients attended meals at scheduled times. They participated in therapeutic activities, occupational therapy, light physical exercise, educational classes. The goal was to ease men back toward normal function gradually, to create an environment that was safe, but not so comfortable that patients had no incentive to improve. Yet walking through these hospitals revealed the diversity and severity of shell shock symptoms. In one room might be a patient sitting motionless, staring at nothing, unreachable despite efforts to communicate. In another, a man would be pacing constantly, unable to sit still, driven by anxiety that found no outlet. Screams might come from nightmares, men waking in terror from dreams of bombardment or attack. Some patients were violent, their trauma expressing itself in aggression toward staff or other patients. Others were withdrawn, speaking to no one, eating little, seeming to wish for nothing except to be left alone. The younger officers assigned to work with these patients often felt overwhelmed, uncertain how to help, confronted with forms of suffering they had not been trained to address. The class dynamics of shell shock treatment were notable and troubling. Officers and enlisted men, even when suffering the same symptoms, were often treated differently. Officers were more likely to be sent to hospitals like Craiglockhart to receive talk therapy and relatively gentle treatments. Enlisted men were more likely to be subjected to harsh therapies like electrical treatment, based on assumptions about their lesser education and greater susceptibility to suggestion. This differential treatment reflected broader social attitudes. Officers, drawn from higher social classes, were assumed to have broken down because they were sensitive. Intelligent men overwhelmed by horrors that offended their refined sensibilities. Enlisted men from working-class backgrounds were more likely to be viewed as lacking moral fiber, requiring harsh treatment to restore them to duty. The same symptoms were interpreted through different lenses, depending on the patient's social class. Many shell shock patients never fully recovered. They were discharged from the military, categorized as no longer fit for service, and sent home to families and communities that often had little understanding of what they had experienced or how to help them. These men returned to civilian life bearing invisible wounds that affected every aspect of their existence. They could not hold employment because their tremors made manual work impossible, or because their startle responses made them unsuitable for any environment with sudden noises. They struggled with relationships, their trauma creating distance between themselves and family members who could not understand the changes in their personalities. The nightmares continued for years, for decades, for lifetimes. Men who served in 1914 to 1918 were still waking screaming in the 1950s and 1960s, their sleep forever contaminated by memories of the trenches. Some developed elaborate avoidance strategies, refusing to attend fireworks displays or to be in crowds, arranging their lives to minimize triggers that might provoke panic or flashbacks. Substance abuse became common among shell-shock veterans. Alcohol provided temporary relief from symptoms, a way to quiet the nightmares or calm the anxiety, and many veterans fell into addiction. Others became dependent on the sedatives and narcotics prescribed by physicians who had few other tools to offer. These addictions created additional problems, financial difficulties, strained relationships, health complications, layering new suffering onto existing trauma. Suicide rates among shell-shock veterans were elevated, though exact statistics are difficult to establish. Some men, unable to endure the continuing symptoms, unable to find relief or hope of recovery, chose to end their lives. These suicides, often occurring years or decades after the war ended, were late casualties of the conflict. Men killed by psychological wounds as surely as their comrades had been killed by bullets and shells. The families of shell-shock veterans bore their own burden. Wives found themselves caring for husbands who were physically present but psychologically changed, who could not work, who woke screaming in the night, who sometimes directed their trauma-driven anger toward those closest to them. Children grew up with fathers they might barely recognize, trying to reconcile stories of the men their fathers had been before the war with the damaged individuals who returned. Despite the suffering it caused, shell shock had one profoundly important effect. It forced medical and military establishments to recognize psychological trauma as a legitimate casualty of war. The sheer scale of the phenomenon, the tens of thousands of cases that could not be dismissed as individual weakness or malingering, compelled acknowledgement that modern warfare produced psychological as well as physical casualties. This recognition came slowly and incompletely. Throughout the war itself, attitudes remained mixed, treatment remained inconsistent, and many shell-shock victims continued to face suspicion and harsh treatment. But by the war's end, official medical doctrine in most combatant nations acknowledged that psychological breakdown could occur in previously healthy, courageous soldiers exposed to sufficient stress. This acknowledgement carried forward into subsequent conflicts. In the Second World War, psychological casualties were anticipated and planned for from the beginning. Terms like battle fatigue and combat exhaustion replaced shell shock, reflecting evolving understanding. But the fundamental recognition remained: combat trauma was real. It could affect anyone, and it required medical treatment rather than punishment. The pathway from shell shock to the modern diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, runs through subsequent conflicts, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, each adding to clinical understanding, each revealing new dimensions of how trauma affects the human psyche. The formal recognition of PTSD in 1980, its inclusion in the diagnostic manual used by psychiatrists and psychologists, represented the culmination of a process that began with physicians like Charles Myers struggling to understand the trembling, mute soldiers of the Great War. Contemporary understanding of trauma, of how overwhelming experiences can alter brain function and behavior, of how memory and emotion interact in complex ways, owes much to the forced learning of 1914 to 1918. The veterans who suffered from shell shock, who were guinea pigs for experimental treatments, who lived with their symptoms for decades, contributed through their suffering to knowledge that now helps trauma survivors of all kinds combat veterans, certainly, but also survivors of accidents, violence, natural disasters, and other overwhelming experiences. Even now, more than a century later, aspects of shell shock remain mysterious. Why did some men break while others endured similar or worse experiences and remained functional? The question has no simple answer. Researchers have proposed numerous factors: previous psychological resilience or vulnerability, the specific nature and duration of trauma exposure, genetic predispositions, the availability of social support, even simple chance. The variability of symptoms also defies simple explanation. Why did trauma manifest as tremor in one soldier, mutism in another, paralysis in a third? Why did some men develop symptoms immediately after a traumatic incident, while others seemed fine for months before sudden collapse? Contemporary neuroscience offers partial answers involving stress hormones, neural pathways, and brain structure, but much remains uncertain. What is clear is that shell shock revealed something fundamental about human limits. There is only so much that people can endure before something breaks. That breaking point varies among individuals, but it exists for everyone. The soldiers of the Great War found that breaking point, pushed beyond it by the unprecedented conditions of industrial warfare, and their suffering made visible what previous generations of warriors had likely experienced but lacked language to describe. As you rest now, in the quiet comfort of the present, spare a thought perhaps for those men who could not rest, whose nights were haunted by memories of trenches and bombardments, who carried the war within them long after the guns fell silent. Their struggle to survive their own minds, to find peace after trauma, continues in different forms today, in veterans of subsequent wars and in trauma survivors everywhere. The invisible wounds, it turns out, are no less real than those that bleed. Shell shock taught that lesson at terrible cost. We have journeyed together through the trenches, through the mud and terror of the front lines, through the catastrophic violence of the Somme, through the invisible wounds that shattered men's minds. These experiences belong to the soldiers, the millions of ordinary men who filled the trenches, who went over the top when ordered, who endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. But every army has a hierarchy, a structure of command that extends upward from the private soldier through layers of rank to the generals who direct strategy and operations. And in the First World War, this hierarchy created a physical distance that mirrored and reinforced a psychological gulf between those who fought and those who commanded. While soldiers lived in dugouts that might collapse at any moment, while they slept in mud and ate cold rations and waited for the shell that might bear their names, the senior officers who planned the campaigns inhabited a different world entirely. Their headquarters were established in requisitioned chateaux, in manor houses and estates miles behind the front lines, far from the sound of the guns, insulated from the immediate dangers that defined life in the trenches. This distance, physical, social, and psychological, became one of the defining controversies of the Great War. Were the generals callous aristocrats, sending men to die while they dined on fine china? Or were they overwhelmed leaders, struggling with an impossible task, trying to command millions in a form of warfare that no one truly understood. The answer, as we shall see, contains elements of both perspectives, nuances that resist simple judgment. Let us move now, in these late hours, away from the front lines, back through the communication trenches and the reserve positions, back through the artillery lines and the supply depots, to the chateau where the generals planned their offensives and lived their curiously comfortable existence in the midst of history's most destructive war. Imagine, if you will, a French chateau in the countryside behind the Western Front. It is perhaps a 17th century building, elegant stone construction, surrounded by gardens that have been maintained despite the war. This is the headquarters of a British army or corps, and it houses the general and his staff who direct operations for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The chateau itself has been transformed into a military nerve center. Its rooms now contain map tables, telephone exchanges, filing cabinets stuffed with operational orders and intelligence reports. Staff officers move through the corridors carrying documents, consulting maps, drafting orders that will be transmitted forward to divisions and brigades and battalions. But the transformation is incomplete. The chateau retains much of its peacetime character. The furniture remains ornate chairs, polished tables, carpets that muffle footsteps. The paintings still hang on the walls. The windows look out over grounds where soldiers may be drilling or where vehicles are parked, but which fundamentally retain their designed beauty. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force for much of the war, maintained his headquarters at various chateaux as the front shifted. His headquarters at Montreuil, in a chateau well behind the lines, included not only offices, but living quarters that preserved a remarkable degree of comfort. Haig had his own bedroom, a private office, access to bathing facilities with hot water luxuries that would have seemed almost incomprehensible to the soldiers in the trenches. The daily routine at these headquarters bore little resemblance to life at the front. Haig rose at a regular hour, breakfasted on proper food served by orderlies, and then proceeded to his office to review reports and confer with staff. Meals were served at scheduled times in a dining room, often with multiple courses, wine, and the rituals of formal dining preserved despite the war raging miles away. The contrast with trench life could hardly be more stark. While a soldier in the front line ate cold tinned beef with dirty hands, standing in mud, the generals sat at tables with white linens. While men in dugouts tried to sleep through bombardments, the generals slept in beds in rooms where the sound of artillery was distant enough to be ignorable. The war, for the generals, was an intellectual exercise conducted in relative comfort, not a visceral experience of survival. The maps and the reality. Central to headquarters operations were the maps. Large-scale maps covered tables in operations rooms, marked with colored pins and pencil lines showing trench systems, unit positions, objectives for planned attacks. Staff officers studied these maps for hours, measuring distances, calculating timing, planning the movements of divisions. The maps were technical achievements based on aerial reconnaissance and survey work, generally accurate in their depiction of terrain and trench locations. But they were also abstractions, representations that removed the reality of what they depicted. A line on a map indicating a trench system gave no sense of the mud, the smell, the fear. A distance measured in yards on a map bore no relationship to the experience of crossing that ground under machine gun fire. Generals and staff officers planned attacks by studying these maps, moving pins to represent divisions, drawing arrows to show lines of advance. The 34th Division will advance here, a staff officer might say, moving a pin forward on the map. The pin represented roughly 12,000 men, but on the map it was just a colored marker, easily moved. The complexity and humanity it represented reduced to a symbol. This abstraction was perhaps necessary. No commander could function if he fully internalized the human cost of every order, but it contributed to the disconnect between headquarters and frontline reality. The maps showed objectives that could be reached by units advancing at a certain speed across measured distances. They could not show the machine gun nests that would cut down attacking troops, the uncut wire that would stop advances, the shell holes and mud that would slow movement to a crawl. When attacks failed, as they so often did, the generals studied their maps and tried to understand why. The plan had seemed sound on paper. The artillery preparation had been adequate by all calculations. The attacking units should have been able to reach their objectives. That they had not, that thousands had become casualties for minimal gain, represented a puzzle to be solved through more careful planning, modified tactics, perhaps a longer bombardment next time. Rarely did the generals themselves go forward to observe the ground over which they were ordering attacks. Some did there are accounts of senior officers visiting frontline trenches, seeing conditions firsthand. But these visits were exceptional, brief excursions into a world the generals normally experienced only through reports and maps. They would return to their chateau, to their maps and telephones, and continue planning operations based on abstract representations rather than lived experience. Surrounding the generals were their staff officers, usually younger men, responsible for translating strategic intentions into operational orders, for managing logistics, for maintaining communication with subordinate units. These staff officers inhabited the same comfortable headquarters environment as the generals, and many had little or no experience of frontline conditions. The British Army's staff system drew heavily on officers educated at elite public schools and universities, men from upper and middle-class backgrounds who had been trained in administration and planning. They were often competent at their technical duties organizing supply lines, coordinating artillery support, drafting clear orders. But their social background and their distance from the front line created a gulf between them and the soldiers they were directing. There are accounts, bitter and sarcastic, from junior officers who visited headquarters on liaison duties. They described staff officers, comfortable in their chateau offices, making decisions about matters they had never personally witnessed. Tell the men to simply push through the wire, a staff officer might say, unaware that the wire was 30 feet deep and had not been cut by the bombardment. The troops must move more quickly, another might insist, not understanding the weight of equipment soldiers carried or the difficulty of crossing broken ground under fire. Some staff officers were aware of this problem, troubled by the disconnect between their planning and frontline reality. They sought information from returning officers, read reports carefully, tried to factor in the difficulties that their maps and plans could not fully capture. But the system encouraged abstract thinking, planning based on ideal conditions, calculations that assumed soldiers could move at certain speeds and accomplish certain tasks without full accounting for the chaos and terror of combat. The staff officers also served as filters between the generals and the front line. Reports from forward units passed through layers of staff review before reaching the commanding general. In this process, information might be summarized, interpreted, or unconsciously edited to fit expectations. A staff officer, reading a report of an attack that achieved minimal gains at heavy cost, might present it to the general as some success with moderate casualties, softening the reality. This filtering was not necessarily malicious. It reflected the challenge of managing information in a large organization, the difficulty of conveying complex, ambiguous situations in brief summaries. But it meant that generals often had an incomplete or overly optimistic understanding of conditions at the front, making decisions based on information that had been processed and refined until it bore limited resemblance to ground truth reality. Perhaps nothing symbolizes the disconnect of headquarters life more than the food. While soldiers in the trenches ate monotonous rations, tinned beef, hard biscuits, weak tea, the generals and their staffs dined on meals that would have been respectable in peacetime London or Paris. The requisitioned chateau came with kitchens, and the army ensured that headquarters were supplied with proper food. Fresh meat, vegetables, bread, wine all were available at headquarters in quantities and qualities unknown at the front. French cooks might be employed to prepare meals. Orderlies served food in dining rooms, maintaining peacetime conventions of formal service. Haig's headquarters was known for maintaining particularly high standards. Meals were served at regular times with proper courses: soup, main dishes, desserts. Wine accompanied dinner. The general and his senior staff ate together, discussing the war's progress over food that bore no resemblance to frontline rations. This was not unusual or specific to Haig. All senior headquarters maintained similar standards. The rationale was that commanders needed to maintain their health and mental sharpness, that proper nutrition and comfortable surroundings enabled them to make sound decisions. And from a certain bureaucratic perspective, this made sense. A well-rested, well-fed commander would indeed function better than one living in the same deprivation as frontline troops. But the symbolism was damaging. Soldiers who rotated back from the trenches, who passed through rear areas, and perhaps glimpsed headquarters life, could not help but notice the disparity. They were enduring hell while their commanders dined in comfort. This bred resentment, a sense that the generals did not truly understand or share the soldiers' suffering because they were insulated from it by privilege and distance. The French army experienced mutinies in 1917, partly triggered by the sense that soldiers were being uselessly sacrificed in offensives that gained nothing. The mutinies were about more than food. They were fundamentally about trust and leadership. But the visible disparity between headquarters comfort and frontline misery contributed to the breakdown in morale. Soldiers were willing to defend France, but they were no longer willing to attack in futile offensives planned by generals who seemed to neither understand nor care about the cost. The comfort of headquarters reflected and reinforced the class divisions that structured British and other nations' armies. Officers, particularly senior officers, came predominantly from upper-class backgrounds, the aristocracy and gentry, families with wealth and social position. They had attended prestigious schools, had been trained from childhood to command, to view themselves as natural leaders. The enlisted ranks came from working-class backgrounds: factory workers, farm laborers, clerks, tradesmen. They had limited education, few prospects for advancement in civilian life, and in military life, they were expected to obey orders from officers they recognized as social superiors. This class system was baked into military structure. Officers had separate quarters, better rations, orderlies to attend them, privileges that marked their status. The generals at the top of this hierarchy enjoyed the greatest privileges: the chateau, the formal dining, the comfortable beds. It was simply assumed that men of their social standing required and deserved such accommodations. The junior officers, particularly those promoted from the ranks or granted temporary commissions, existed in an ambiguous position. They had authority over enlisted men, but were often viewed with subtle condescension by career officers from elite backgrounds. In mess halls and officers' quarters behind the lines, social distinctions remained important. The temporary gentlemen, as promoted officers were sometimes dismissively called, were reminded in various ways that their officer status was provisional, that they were not truly part of the class that traditionally commanded. These class divisions affected military effectiveness. Orders passed down a rigid hierarchy, and questioning or debating those orders was discouraged. A junior officer who had been in the trenches, who had seen the uncut wire and the machine gun positions, might recognize the flaws in a planned attack, but he had limited ability to push that information upward, to challenge the plans made by superiors many ranks above him. The PALS battalions, which we discussed in relation to the Somme, represented a partial exception to class divisions. These units drew officers and enlisted men from the same communities, creating bonds that transcended traditional class boundaries. But even in PALS battalions, the formal structures of rank were maintained, and senior commanders remained distant figures from a different social world. Given the disconnect between headquarters and the front, given the comfortable conditions in which generals lived while ordering men to die, it is tempting to conclude that the generals were simply incompetent, aristocratic fools playing with soldiers' lives. This judgment appears in much post-war literature and popular understanding, the image of lions led by donkeys, brave soldiers betrayed by foolish commanders. But this judgment, while containing elements of truth, is too simple. The generals of the First World War were not uniformly incompetent, nor were they operating in conditions that made success straightforward for any commander, however talented. Consider the challenges they faced. They were commanding armies of unprecedented size, millions of men, requiring coordination of supply, transport, medical services, and operations on a scale never before attempted. The armies were too large to be commanded through personal presence. A general could not ride along the line, as Napoleon had done, could not personally observe and direct his forces. Command had to be exercised through layers of hierarchy, through written and telephoned orders, through delegation to subordinates. The technology of warfare had evolved faster than tactical and strategic thinking. Machine guns, quick-firing artillery, barbed wire, these had made defense extraordinarily powerful. Attacking forces suffered devastating casualties because defensive weapons had outpaced offensive capabilities. But what was the alternative? The generals were under political pressure to attack, to regain lost territory, to support allies, to win the war. Defensive stalemate, waiting in trenches while diplomats sought negotiated peace, was not an acceptable option to the political leadership. The generals experimented with tactics, trying to find solutions to the defensive advantage. Artillery bombardments were meant to destroy defenses before attacks. Creeping barrages were developed to provide covering fire for advancing troops. Tanks were introduced. Infantry tactics evolved towards small unit maneuver rather than linear waves. These innovations came slowly, through trial and error that cost many lives, but they did come. By 1918, the armies that won the war had learned how to conduct combined arms operations that could break through defensive positions, but the learning curve was measured in years and casualties. Some generals were better than others. Haig, frequently criticized as the epitome of the out-of-touch commander, was neither the best nor the worst. He persisted with offensives longer than results justified, the Somme and Passchendaele particularly resulting in enormous casualties for limited gains. But he also oversaw the development of the tactics that eventually won the war, and his armies in 1918 were far more effective than in 1916. Other generals showed greater adaptability or understanding. Plumer, commanding the Second Army, was known for careful planning and concern for casualties. The Battle of Messines Ridge in 1917, under his command, achieved its objectives with relatively moderate losses because of meticulous preparation. But even successful generals operated within the same system, the same distance from the front, the same fundamental challenge of commanding mass armies in industrial warfare. Perhaps more significant than the physical distance between chateaux and trenches was the psychological distance. The generals had been formed by different experiences than the soldiers they commanded. Many had served in colonial wars, small-scale conflicts against technologically inferior opponents, where European armies achieved victories through superior organization and firepower. These colonial experiences provided core preparation for the Western Front. In colonial warfare, casualties were usually light, victories were common, and the enemy could be dismissed as primitive or poorly led. The generals brought these assumptions to the Great War and found them catastrophically wrong. The German army was not poorly organized or primitively equipped. It was as technologically advanced and professionally led as their own forces. But adjusting deeply held assumptions is difficult for anyone, and perhaps especially difficult for men who had achieved high rank, who had been successful in their previous military experiences, who were accustomed to being deferred to rather than questioned. The cognitive dissonance between their expectations and the reality of the Western Front was resolved, often by blaming execution rather than questioning the fundamental approach. If an attack failed, it must be because the troops did not advance with sufficient determination, or the artillery preparation was inadequate, or subordinate commanders made errors, not because the strategic concept was flawed. The generals also faced political pressures that colored their decision-making. They were not free agents who could conduct the war according to purely military logic. They received direction from political leaders who demanded offensives, who wanted victories to show their populations and their allies, who could not accept years of stalemate without some visible action. Haig's persistence with the Somme offensive in 1916, continuing the battle long after the initial objectives were clearly unattainable, partly reflected political pressure. The British government had committed to the offensive in coordination with the French. Stopping would mean abandoning allies, would be seen as a failure of will. So the offensive continued, grinding forward through summer and fall, because political calculations demanded it continue. The generals were also aware of morale and public opinion in ways that made certain decisions necessary, despite their military cost. After taking casualties, after suffering through offensives, armies needed some sense of progress or purpose. Remaining purely defensive, never attacking, would have damaged morale as much as costly offensives. The soldiers needed to feel they were fighting for victory, not simply enduring in trenches until the enemy tired of the war. Not all generals remained isolated in their chateau. Some made efforts to understand frontline conditions, to see personally what they were ordering men to endure. These visits were rare, but significant when they occurred. Junior generals, brigade, and division commanders were closer to the front by necessity. They maintained headquarters within a few miles of the trenches, visited their units more frequently, had more direct knowledge of conditions. But even they lived in relative comfort compared to soldiers, and even they commanded at a remove, planning operations from headquarters rather than participating in them. The rare senior commander who ventured into the frontline trenches was often shocked by what he found. The mud, the smell, the narrowness of the trenches, the omnipresent danger, these were abstractions until experienced. Some generals, after such visits, became more cautious in their planning, more aware what they were asking troops to endure. Others remained committed to their strategies, but gained a grudging respect for what the soldiers endured. There are accounts of generals becoming emotional after visiting casualty clearing stations, seeing the wounded from attacks they had ordered, confronting the human cost of their decisions. These moments of connection were genuine, but they were also temporary. The general would return to his chateau, to his maps and his staff conferences, and the distance would reassert itself. The system, ultimately, did not encourage or reward generals who dwelled too much on the human cost of their decisions. A commander who hesitated, who allowed the suffering he was ordering to paralyze his decision-making, would be seen as weak, as unsuited for command. The job required a certain psychological distance, an ability to order attacks that would kill thousands while maintaining focus on strategic objectives. The physical distance of the chateau reinforced and enabled this necessary psychological distance. The debate over the generals of the First World War continues more than a century later. Historians argue about whether they were incompetent or overwhelmed, callous or simply realistic, whether the casualties they accepted were necessary or avoidable. Some historians emphasize the learning curve, arguing that the generals eventually developed effective tactics, that by 1918 they had solved the problems of trench warfare and were winning a mobile war of maneuver. The casualties of 1916 to 1,917 were the price of this learning, unfortunate but unavoidable given the unprecedented nature of industrial warfare. Other historians emphasize the waste, the repeated offensives that gained nothing, the failure to learn from experience, the tendency to blame troops for insufficient determination rather than questioning flawed plans. They point to the disparity between headquarters comfort and frontline suffering as evidence of a moral failure, a disconnection that allowed generals to treat men as expendable resources. Both perspectives have merit. The generals were neither completely incompetent nor completely blameless. They were men, products of their time and class, facing challenges that exceeded anyone's experience or training making decisions with imperfect information under enormous pressure, protected by distance from the immediate consequences of those decisions. What is clear is that the system, the physical separation of headquarters from front lines, the class divisions that structured armies, the size of forces that made personal command impossible created conditions where bad decisions could persist, where feedback from the front was filtered and delayed, where the people planning operations had limited understanding of the conditions under which those operations would be executed. For the soldiers in the trenches, the generals were distant, almost mythical figures. Most soldiers never saw a general, never came within miles of a headquarters chateau. They knew their immediate officers, the lieutenants and captains who shared the trenches with them, but brigade commanders and above were names and orders, not real people. The soldiers' attitude toward senior commanders was complex. There was respect for rank and authority, conditioned by military discipline and social tradition. There was also resentment, a sense that the generals did not truly understand what they were enduring, did not share their risks or hardships. The bitter poetry and memoir literature that emerged after the war often expresses this resentment. Siegfried Sassoon's poem, The General, with its lines about the incompetent swine who sends men to die, captures a common sentiment. Wilfred Owen's letters home speak of the gulf between the staff officers planning attacks and the soldiers who must execute them. Yet soldiers also recognized, sometimes, that the general's job was impossible. They were being asked to win an unwinnable war using tactics that had not yet been developed. They were under political pressure to attack when attack led to slaughter. They were managing organizations of unprecedented complexity with communications technology that was barely adequate. The ordinary soldier's primary loyalty was not to distant generals, but to immediate comrades, to the men in his platoon or company who shared his suffering. The generals might issue the orders, but survival depended on the men to the left and right, on the sergeant who had been through previous attacks, on the officer who was willing to go over the top first. Imagine as this long night continues, the weight carried by a general commanding hundreds of thousands of men. He wakes in his comfortable bed in the chateau. Breakfast is served by orderlies. He proceeds to his office where maps show the positions of divisions under his command. Each division represents roughly 12,000 men-sons, fathers, brothers, husbands. He orders an attack, pins move on maps, and in the execution of that order, thousands will become casualties. How does a human being carry this weight? Some generals, memoirs and letters suggest, became harder, more distant as a psychological defense. They could not allow themselves to fully internalize the human cost of their decisions without becoming paralyzed. The comfort of the chateau, the rituals of formal dining, the distance from the front, these helped maintain the psychological detachment necessary for command. Other generals were haunted by their decisions. They made the calculations that military logic demanded, but struggled with the moral burden. They visited hospitals, saw the wounded, and carried that image with them. They wrote letters of condolence to families, hundreds of letters, knowing that their orders had created these griefs. In the years after the war, some generals defended their decisions, wrote memoirs justifying their strategies. Others retreated into silence, perhaps unable or unwilling to discuss what they had done. The verdict of history has been harsh on many of them, but history makes its judgments with the benefit of hindsight, with knowledge of what alternatives might have been possible, without the pressure of the moment when decisions had to be made. Ultimately, the disconnect between chateau and trenches reflected something larger than individual generals' failings. It was a systemic problem, built into the structure of how mass armies were commanded in the early 20th century. Communications technology, telephones, and telegraphs allowed coordination over distance, but did not convey the texture of experience. A telephone report from the front could convey facts. Attack commenced at 0730. Objectives not reached. Casualties heavy, but could not convey the reality of those casualties, the sounds and smells and fear. The size of armies made personal leadership impossible. A corps commander directing 50,000 men could not be everywhere, could not see all his units, had to trust subordinates and work from reports. The distance from front lines to headquarters was partly a practical necessity. Senior headquarters needed to be positioned where communications converged, where they could coordinate multiple divisions, where they were not so vulnerable to shelling that operations would be disrupted. But necessity does not negate consequence. The system that required generals to command from Chateau, to work from maps rather than observation, to receive filtered information through multiple layers of subordinates, was a system that made certain kinds of errors inevitable and difficult to correct. Reforms were attempted. Efforts were made to improve communication, to get more accurate information from the front, to ensure that generals understood conditions. But the fundamental structure persisted through the war, and the disconnect between command and execution remained a chronic problem. As we reach the end of this exploration, the contrast remains. The soldiers in the trenches, living in mud, enduring bombardment, going over the top into machine gun fire. The generals in Chateau, planning offensives over maps, dining on multiple courses, sleeping in beds. The distance between these two realities, measured in miles, but also in experience, in class, in power defined, much about how the Great War was fought and why it unfolded as it did. Neither reality was chosen by the individuals who inhabited it. The soldiers did not ask to be sent to the trenches. The generals did not design the system that placed them in Chateau. They were all, in different ways, trapped by circumstances, by history, by a war that exceeded human scale and human understanding. But the disconnect had consequences measured in lives and suffering, in offensives that failed, in casualties that might have been avoided with better understanding, in the bitter legacy of resentment that persists even now when we examine these events a century later. The lights in the chateau windows, warm and welcoming, symbolizing comfort and order and civilization, were visible sometimes from the front lines, a reminder of what lay behind, of what waited for those who survived. But they were also a symbol of distance, of separation, of the gulf between those who commanded and those who endured. And in the trenches, men stood watch through cold nights, waiting for the whistle that would send them forward, knowing that their lives might end tomorrow in an attack planned by generals they would never meet, for objectives marked on maps they would never see, in a war whose larger purposes seemed increasingly distant from the immediate struggle to survive each day. The Great War continues into the night, but our exploration draws toward its close. Let the contrasts we have examined settle quietly in your thoughts as we move now toward the conclusion of our journey through this history. We have traveled far tonight, you and I, through landscapes of mud and wire, through days of unimaginable violence, through the invisible territories of psychological trauma, through the contrasting worlds that existed simultaneously within the same war. The journey has taken us to places distant, not only in time, but in human experience, to realities so far removed from our present comfort that they strain comprehension. And now, as our exploration reaches its natural conclusion, let us draw back. Let us return across the years and decades that separate us from those events. Let us find ourselves once more in the present moment, in the quiet safety of here and now. The trenches of the Western Front, where millions of men lived an underground existence unlike anything in previous human history. We have stood in those narrow corridors of mud and sandbag, felt the cold water seeping through boots, heard the shells whistling overhead, watched the rats moving fearlessly through a landscape they had claimed as their own. We have understood, perhaps, something of the monotony punctuated by terror, the endless routine of stand to and maintenance and watch, interrupted by moments when death arrived randomly, indifferently, in the form of a shell fragment or a sniper's bullet. We have witnessed July 1st, 1916, that single day on the Somme, when the optimism of planning collided with the reality of machine gun fire and uncut wire. We have seen the lines of soldiers walking across no man's land into withering fire, have counted the casualties in tens of thousands. have understood what those numbers meant in individual terms, in communities that lost their young men in a single morning, in families that received telegrams and tried to comprehend the incomprehensible. We have explored the invisible wounds, the shell shock that shattered men's minds as surely as shells shattered their bodies. We have seen the trembling hands, heard the screams from nightmares, watched men who could no longer speak or walk despite having no physical injuries. We have followed the slow, painful process by which medicine began to recognize psychological trauma as legitimate, how the suffering of thousands forced acknowledgement that there are limits to human endurance, that courage alone cannot protect against the accumulated weight of horror. And we have stood in the chateau where generals planned their offensives, where maps covered tables and pins represented divisions, where the war was an intellectual exercise conducted in comfort, where the distance between command and execution allowed decisions to be made without full understanding of their human cost. We have examined that distance, physical and psychological, and considered its consequences. More than a century has passed since these events. The soldiers who stood in those trenches, who went over the top on that July morning, who struggled with shell shock, who planned the offenses or questioned the orders, they are gone now. All of them passed into history along with the world they inhabited. The trenches themselves have largely disappeared, filled in by farmers reclaiming their land, softened by grass and weather until only fragments remain, preserved in places as memorials, but mostly erased by time's patient work. The shell craters have become ponds or gentle depressions in fields. The barbed wire has long since rusted away. The mud that defined so much of the soldier's experience has dried and been plowed under, season after season, until the land has forgotten what it witnessed. The chateaux still stand, many of them returned to peacetime purposes or converted to museums. The maps have been archived. The telegrams delivered to grieving families have yellowed in drawers and attics. The letters written home, the diaries kept in dugouts, the photographs of young men in uniform, these have become historical documents, studied by researchers, but the immediacy of the experience they record has faded into the past. And yet, the Great War remains present in certain ways. The cemeteries with their rows of white headstones continue to mark the landscape of France and Belgium. The memorial's steepful with its 72,000 names, Menin Gate with its nightly ceremony, countless smaller monuments in towns and villages ensure that the scale of loss is not forgotten. The literature and poetry that emerged from the war continues to be read, teaching new generations something of what those years meant. The soldiers who survived, who returned home to civilian life, who lived into old age, carrying their memories and their scars. They told stories to children and grandchildren, though often the most difficult stories remained untold, kept silent because they resisted language or because the burden of sharing them seemed too great. Those grandchildren are elderly now themselves, the last living connections to people who experienced the Great War directly, and when they pass, the war will move entirely into the realm of history, no longer within living memory. The First World War marked a boundary, a before and after in human civilization. The world that existed before 1914, with its confidence in progress, its assumptions about warfare, its social structures and hierarchies, did not survive the war intact. What emerged afterward was different, marked by disillusionment, by awareness of human capacity for destruction, by questioning of authorities that had led so many to death. The tactical lessons of the war, how to break through defensive positions, how to coordinate infantry and artillery and armor, how to manage logistics for mass armies, were learned and applied in subsequent conflicts. The Second World War's battlefields bore the marks of what had been learned in 1914 to 1918, though at even greater scale and with even more destructive technology. The psychological understanding forced by shell shock evolved through subsequent conflicts into contemporary recognition of PTSD and trauma. The veterans struggling with nightmares and flashbacks today are the descendants, in experience, if not always in lineage, of those shell-shocked soldiers of the Great War. The understanding that warfare wounds minds as well as bodies, now accepted though still imperfectly applied, began with the physicians and patients of 1914 to 1918. The social changes catalyzed by the war, the involvement of women in war work, the beginnings of breakdown in rigid class structures, the political upheavals that toppled empires and redrew maps created the 20th century world that followed. The war was not solely responsible for these changes, but it accelerated and intensified them, compressed transformations that might have taken generations into 4 years of total war. Was there meaning in all that suffering? Did the deaths of millions accomplish anything that justified their cost? These questions have no satisfying answers. The war achieved certain outcomes, defeated the Central Powers, established new nations, reshaped the political order, but whether these outcomes were worth the price is a question that each generation answers differently. For the soldiers themselves, meaning was often found not in grand strategic purposes, but in smaller, more immediate things. The bonds with comrades, the sense of having endured something extraordinary, the simple fact of survival. Many veterans, particularly in the years immediately after the war, expressed profound disillusionment, a sense that they had been used and discarded, that their sacrifice had been for nothing. Others found ways to integrate their experience into life narratives that preserved meaning, that allowed them to see their service as valuable despite its cost. The societies that sent these men to war struggled with similar questions. Memorials were built, ceremonies established, languages of honor and sacrifice deployed to make sense of the losses. But beneath the official commemorations ran currents of doubt, of anger, of questioning whether those who died had been betrayed by the leaders who sent them to war. Perhaps meaning is not something that can be assigned to such events from outside, but something that each person touched by them must construct for themselves. The war was what it was, a catastrophe that consumed millions of lives, that transformed the world, that revealed both the worst and occasionally the best of human nature. What it means depends on what questions we ask of it, what we seek to understand or remember. You, listening now in the quiet of late evening or the deep hours of night, are separated from these events by time that provides safety and perspective. The trenches cannot claim you. The shells cannot reach you. The machine guns are silent, the gas dispersed, the battles long finished. The men who endured those experiences are at rest now, their struggles ended, their suffering past. This distance allows us to examine these events with a certain calm, to explore them without being consumed by them, to learn from them without being destroyed by them. We can acknowledge the horror of what occurred while remaining secure in the knowledge that it is history, that it belongs to the past, that we are here, now, in a different time. The world you inhabit, for all its problems and challenges, is not the world of 1914 to 1918. You will not wait tomorrow to stand to in a trench. You will not be ordered to walk into machine gun fire. Your mind, whatever stresses it may face, will not be subjected to the particular horrors of industrial warfare that broke so many in that conflict. The distance of a century is a gift, one that allows us to remember and learn without having to experience. As you settle now into rest, into sleep, let the images and stories of this night fade gently into the background of your consciousness. They have served their purpose to illuminate a piece of history, to honor in some small way those who endured what we have explored, to provide context for understanding how our world was shaped by events now distant. Memory works in cycles, in rhythms of remembering and forgetting. The Great War has passed through various phases of cultural memory. Immediately after, when it was raw and present in millions of lives. Then through decades when it receded, when other wars and other concerns took precedence. More recently, as the centenary of various battles was marked, there has been renewed attention, renewed efforts to understand and commemorate. But memory fades, inevitably. The individual memories held by participants faded first as soldiers aged and died. The cultural memory, maintained through memorials and ceremonies and education, persists longer but also evolves, becomes more abstract, less immediate. Eventually, the Great War will be as distant to human consciousness as the Napoleonic Wars or the 30 Years' War, significant historical events, studied by specialists, but no longer carrying emotional weight for most people. This fading is natural, perhaps necessary. Each generation must attend to its own challenges, its own conflicts, its own questions. The Great War's lessons remain relevant about the costs of war, about human endurance and breakdown, about leadership and its failures, but those lessons can be absorbed without maintaining perpetual raw grief over losses that occurred a century ago. Tonight, we have held those events in consciousness, have examined them with care and respect, have tried to understand something of what they meant to those who lived through them. And now, as we release them back into the past, we can do so knowing that the examination itself was a form of honoring. That attention paid to history is a way of ensuring that suffering was not entirely meaningless. The soldiers in the trenches, during their brief rest periods, snatched sleep whenever possible, in dugouts, in shell holes, even standing at their posts when exhaustion overwhelmed them. That sleep was never truly restful, always interrupted by the sounds of war, by the need for vigilance, by the physical discomfort of their surroundings. The sleep available to you tonight is of a different quality entirely. You can sleep in safety, in comfort, without fear of bombardment or attack, without the need to wake at dawn for stand-to. Your sleep can be deep and restorative, can last as long as your body requires, can be entered and exited at natural rhythms rather than at the demands of military necessity. This, perhaps, is part of what those soldiers were fighting for, though they might not have articulated it in such terms. They endured so that others might live in peace, might sleep in safety, might know a world where trenches and poison gas and going over the top were historical curiosities, rather than immediate realities. As sleep approaches, as consciousness begins to soften and drift, carry with you perhaps a quiet gratitude, not guilt, but gratitude for the distance that time provides, for the safety that allows peaceful rest, for living in an era that, for all its challenges, does not require you to endure what we have explored tonight. The Western Front at night, in the brief hours when fighting subsided, held a strange quality. The darkness was never complete. Star shells and flares illuminated the landscape at intervals, and the gun flashes on the horizon created a perpetual flickering glow. But between the illuminations, the darkness was profound, broken only by the stars above, the same stars that shine tonight, unchanged by the human dramas played out beneath them. Those stars witnessed everything: the suffering in the trenches, the slaughter on the Somme, the breaking of minds under intolerable pressure, the generals in their chateaux making decisions that cost thousands of lives. The stars were witness and remained indifferent, as stars do, marking time on scales that make human events, even human catastrophes, seem brief and small. A century later, those same stars shine down on the fields where trenches once scarred the earth, on the cemeteries where the dead lie in ordered rows, on the memorials that name the lost, on the cities and towns that rebuilt after the war, on you now, as you prepare to release consciousness and drift into sleep. The circle closes. The story ends. The war that consumed so many, that changed so much, that marked a generation and shaped a century, recedes into history as all things must. The telling is complete. The night continues. And you, having journeyed through these dark chapters of the past, can return to your present, to your peace, to your rest. Let the trenches fade from your mind's eye. Let the sound of shells diminish to silence. Let the faces of the soldiers, known and unknown, blur gently into the past they inhabit. Let the weight of these stories lift from your consciousness as you settle deeper into relaxation, into the approaching boundary of sleep. The Great War is over. It has been over for more than 100 years. The men who fought it are at peace now. Their struggles ended, their pain concluded. The world has moved on, has passed through other wars and other changes, has arrived at this moment when you lie comfortable and safe, distant in time and space from everything we have discussed. The history remains, preserved in documents and photographs and memorials, available for examination and reflection. But it is history, something that happened, that shaped the present, but that does not threaten, cannot harm, exists now only in memory and in the lessons we choose to draw from it. Rest now. Sleep if sleep comes. Let your mind wander where it will, unencumbered by the need to remember or analyze or process what you have heard. The information will remain, will be there if you wish to reflect on it later, but for now, it can simply rest in the background, a part of the vast landscape of human history that we carry with us, but need not constantly examine. The night holds you safely. The darkness is gentle, not the darkness of no man's land, but the restful darkness of comfortable sleep. The sounds around you are ordinary and peaceful, not the sounds of warfare, but the sounds of life continuing in its usual rhythms. Everything is as it should be. Everything is at rest. The past is past. The present is safe. The future will come in its own time. And for now, there is only the quiet, the calm, the gentle descent into sleep that comes at the end of a long day, at the end of a journey through history, at the end of this shared exploration of a world now gone. Sleep well. Rest peacefully. And when you wake, it will be to a new day, a day belonging entirely to the present, a day unmarked by trenches or shells or the demands of a war that ended long ago. The story is complete. The night continues, and all, for this moment, is quiet.